The scream that shattered the silence. The morning unfolded in quiet normalcy, just as it always did in Cedarwood Estates, a picturesque neighborhood lined with well-manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged friendly nods, where morning routines were sacred, and where peace was never disturbed. Until today. Henry Lawson, a mailman with over 15 years of service, took pride in his route. He knew every crack in the pavement, every address by heart, and most importantly, he knew the people. The Jenkins always left out iced tea on hot days. The Carter's golden retriever, Max, greeted him with an enthusiastic wag each morning. And then there was the Monroe family, Daniel, Olivia, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, a quiet but seemingly happy family who lived in a modest yet elegant home at the end of the street. Henry had just pulled out a stack of letters when the scream cut through the still morning air. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, high-pitched, raw, and filled with unfiltered terror. The kind of scream that sent a chill down the spine, that turned the stomach into knots. Henry stopped mid-step, his hands tightening around the letters as his eyes shot toward the Monroe house. A second later, the front door burst open. A small figure shot out onto the porch. Lily Monroe. She was barefoot, her tiny feet slapping against the pavement as she ran, her nightgown billowing around her small frame. Her golden brown curls were tangled, her pale skin streaked with tears. But it was her face, her expression, that sent a bolt of panic through Henry's chest. Her eyes were wide with absolute, unfiltered terror, and her little hand shook as she clutched the fabric of her gown. Henry barely had time to react before she collided with him, gripping onto his uniform as if he were the only thing keeping her from being swallowed by the fear that gripped her. "Help," she sobbed, her tiny fingers twisting into his shirt. "Mommy. Daddy. Blood." Henry's stomach turned to ice. He crouched down, his hands resting on her trembling shoulders. "Lily, sweetheart, what's wrong? What happened?" She could only shake her head, her sobs hiccuping between ragged breaths. And then, as if the words took everything in her to say, she pointed a shaking finger toward the open front door. Henry turned his gaze toward the house, his pulse hammering in his ears. Something deep in his gut told him, this wasn't just a bad fall. This wasn't an argument gone too far. Something was very, very wrong. A rational part of him screamed to call for help. He was just a mailman. He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't a cop. But then he thought about Lily, this terrified, helpless little girl in his arms, and his feet started moving before he could stop them. With slow, cautious steps, he approached the Monroe house. The front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently with the morning breeze, creaking ever so slightly. The sound felt eerily out of place in the otherwise silent neighborhood. His heart pounded harder. Something was waiting for him inside. As he stepped onto the threshold, his breath hitched. The interior of the Monroe house was still, not the peaceful kind of stillness, but the kind that carried the weight of something terrible. The living room was in disarray, a chair overturned, papers scattered across the coffee table, a half-eaten breakfast abandoned on the floor. It was as if time had stopped mid-action. And then Henry saw her. Olivia Monroe. She was kneeling on the hardwood floor, hunched over a motionless body. Daniel Monroe. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Blood. So much blood. It pooled beneath Daniel's lifeless form, thick and dark, seeping into the floorboards. Olivia's hands, covered in it, clutched the front of his shirt, her fingers trembling as she pressed against his chest, as if she were trying to wake him up. She wasn't crying. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her shoulders shaking violently, her lips parted as if whispering something. Maybe she was, but Henry couldn't hear her over the pounding of his own heartbeat. Henry had seen his fair share of accidents in his years as a mailman. Car crashes, a heart attack once. But this was a crime scene. His first instinct was to back away, to run, But then Olivia lifted her head. Their eyes met. She wasn't guilty. She was terrified. Her lips moved, her voice a raw whisper. "No, please." Henry yanked his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he dialed the only number that made sense. 911. "What's your emergency?" He barely recognized his own voice as he forced out the words. "There's been an emergency. A man. He's not moving. There's a lot of blood." "Sir, what's your location?" "The Monroe House," Henry breathed. 224 Oak Ridge Drive. A hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "No." Olivia's voice cracked, her fingers digging into his arm. "Please, you have to believe me." Henry's pulse thundered in his ears. He barely knew Olivia Monroe. They had exchanged polite nods, maybe small talk once or twice. But right now, he knew one thing. He couldn't trust anything she said. Sirens howled in the distance, cutting through the silence of the morning. Olivia's body sagged. Her hands fell to her lap, stained red. A small whimper came from behind Henry. Lily. She was still standing there, frozen, watching everything. Henry turned just in time to catch the look on her tiny face. Terror. Utter, heart-wrenching terror. And that was the moment he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The blood-stained secrets. The piercing wail of sirens cut through the thick silence of Cedarwood Estates, a stark contrast to the stillness that had swallowed the Monroe House. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pristine suburban street in chaotic streaks, shattering the illusion of safety that had always lingered here. Henry Lawson stood frozen on the front porch, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just unfolded. In his 15 years as a mailman, he had never stumbled upon something like this. A crime scene, a child's terrified cries, a house filled with blood and secrets. A hand tugged on his sleeve. He looked down. Lily Monroe. Her small fingers clenched the fabric of his uniform, her face streaked with silent tears. She wasn't crying anymore, but her body trembled with the kind of fear no child should ever experience. He didn't know what to say. How you comfort a child who just lost everything? Before he could even try, the first police car screeched to a halt in front of the house. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the area for immediate danger. "Sir, step away from the house," one of them ordered, his voice sharp with authority. Henry hesitated, his instincts screaming that he shouldn't leave Lily alone, but he knew better than to argue with armed officers. Slowly, he lifted his hands in compliance and stepped aside, his gaze flickering between the officers and Olivia, who was still kneeling inside. She hadn't moved. Her expression was vacant, her hands still coated in red. A paramedic rushed past him, kneeling beside Daniel Monroe's lifeless body. He pressed 2 fingers against Daniel's neck, searching for a pulse. A moment later, he shook his head. "He's gone." Henry swallowed hard. He already knew that. Detective Aaron Mitchell arrived next. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a calculating gaze that never seemed to miss a detail, he moved through the house with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention. He had seen too many crime scenes, too many dead bodies, and yet there was something about this one that made him pause. Something felt off. His partner, Detective Carla Ramirez, followed closely behind. Unlike Mitchell, she was sharp-edged, no-nonsense, and carried herself like she had seen the worst of humanity, and was still waiting to be impressed. Ramirez scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered papers, the untouched breakfast left abandoned on the dining table. "This wasn't random," she murmured, her trained eyes sweeping over the details. No signs of forced entry. No weapon in sight. Mitchell turned his attention to Olivia, who still hadn't spoken a word since the officers arrived. He crouched in front of her. "Mrs. Monroe," he said carefully, "can you tell us what happened here?" Olivia blinked, as if waking from a trance. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then, finally, in a voice so small it was barely audible, She whispered, "I don't know." Mitchell's eyes darkened. "You don't know." She swallowed, her breath unsteady. "I woke up, and he was just there." Her voice cracked. "Dead." Mitchell didn't react immediately. He studied her, his expression unreadable. "Did you touch him?" A long pause. Then, slowly, Olivia nodded. "I tried to wake him up." Mitchell's gaze flickered to her hands, stained with blood. Ramirez crossed her arms. "That explains the prints we're going to find all over the crime scene," she muttered. Henry's stomach twisted. They didn't believe her. And honestly, he wasn't sure if he did either. Mitchell stood, signaling to one of the officers. "Bag her hands for evidence." A uniformed officer stepped forward, gently guiding Olivia to stand. She didn't resist as they slipped evidence bags over her hands, sealing in the bloodstains that might tell a very different story than the one she was giving. "Wait." Olivia's voice cracked as they moved her toward the front door. "Please, I didn't." Her gaze snapped to Lily, her expression crumbling. "Where's my daughter?" Mitchell turned toward Henry. "She was with you." Henry nodded. "She stays with me," Olivia pleaded. "Please." Mitchell hesitated for half a second before nodding toward Ramirez. "Call CPS." Olivia's breath hitched. No, please, don't do this." Henry felt a weight settle in his chest. This was spiraling fast. Lily clung to him tighter, her tiny voice barely above a whisper. "I want my mommy." Henry exhaled slowly. Damn it. He wasn't sure what Olivia had done, or hadn't done, but he knew one thing for sure. Lily didn't belong in some stranger's care. Before he could stop himself, he turned to Mitchell. "Let her stay with me." Mitchell's brows lifted slightly. "You're volunteering to take in a child." Henry hesitated. Was he? He wasn't a father. Hell, he wasn't even married. His job involved delivering mail, not raising kids. But then Lily's grip tightened, and he knew his answer. Yes. Mitchell studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine, but she stays in town. We'll need her for questioning." Henry nodded, ignoring the knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't prepared for this, but then again, neither was Lily. And right now, she needed someone to hold on to. As Olivia was led out of the house in cuffs, Lily buried her face into Henry's chest, her tiny body racked with silent sobs. Henry tightened his grip around her. Whatever had happened in that house, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. 2 days later, the news spread through Cedarwood Estates like wildfire. Local wife arrested for husband's murder. Headlines blared across TV screens. Gossip rippled through neighbors like an electric current. But Henry, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And neither could Lily. "Mr. Henry," she said softly one night, curled up on his couch, wrapped in one of his old blankets. "I saw someone." Henry stilled. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "The night Daddy got hurt, I saw someone in the hallway." A chill crawled down Henry's spine. His voice was careful. "Did you tell the police that?" Lily hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Henry exhaled. Someone had been in that house. Someone besides Olivia. And if Lily was right, that meant Olivia wasn't lying, which meant the real killer was still out there, watching, waiting. And Henry had just become part of the game. Shadows in the hallway. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Henry Lawson sat on his couch, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at nothing in particular. The small lamp beside him cast flickering shadows along the walls, elongating every shape, turning the ordinary into something sinister. Lily Monroe was asleep in the guest room. Or at least, she was trying to be. Her tiny body had trembled for hours before exhaustion finally pulled her under. Even in sleep, she clung to a stuffed rabbit Henry had bought from a gas station earlier that day, her fingers twisting into its soft fur. She was afraid. and Henry didn't blame her. Because someone had been in that house the night Daniel Monroe died. Someone who wasn't Olivia. And that meant two things. The real killer was still out there. Henry had just put himself directly in their path. The missing piece. The next morning, Henry was sitting at his kitchen table, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, when a knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Detective Aaron Mitchell standing on his porch. "You've been busy," Mitchell said, eyeing Henry like he was something to be studied. Henry sighed. Not by choice. Mitchell glanced past him, his eyes briefly landing on the hallway where Lily was still curled up on the couch, her blanket wrapped tightly around her. "She say anything else?" the detective asked. Henry hesitated. He had thought about it all night. Lily had seen someone in the hallway. She had whispered it like a secret too dangerous to say out loud. And for a 6-year-old girl to carry that kind of fear, it meant something. But Henry also knew that telling the wrong person could put her in more danger. Finally, he exhaled and nodded. She saw someone. The night Daniel was killed. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Did she describe them? Henry shook his head. She was scared. She just said there was a shadow in the hallway. Mitchell didn't react, but something in his expression shifted. Something dark, something calculated. He already knew something. Henry narrowed his eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" Mitchell hesitated for just a second too long before finally answering. There was no sign of forced entry. No security footage. Nothing to suggest anyone else was in that house. He paused. But if Lily is telling the truth, that means someone had a key. Henry frowned. "You think it was planned?" Mitchell's eyes darkened. "I think someone made sure Olivia would take the fall." The weight of those words settled heavy in Henry's chest. Someone had wanted Olivia to be blamed, and they had almost gotten away with it. Mitchell sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I need to talk to her again." Henry glanced toward the couch. Lily was still curled up, her tiny chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. "She's been through enough." Mitchell's expression softened just slightly. "I know, but she's the only one who saw the real killer." Henry exhaled slowly. Then he crouched beside the couch, gently shaking Lily's shoulder. Her big, sleepy eyes blinked open, looking up at him with a quiet kind of fear. "Sweetheart," Henry said softly, "the detective needs to ask you a few questions. Is that okay?" Lily hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Mitchell crouched down beside her, his voice softer than Henry had ever heard it. "Lily, can you tell me about the person you saw in the hallway?" Lily's fingers twisted in the blanket. She swallowed hard. Then, finally, she whispered. "He was wearing gloves." Henry's breath caught in his throat. Mitchell's eyes flickered. "Gloves." Lily nodded, her tiny hands tightening around the fabric of the blanket. "And a hood." Mitchell and Henry exchanged a look. Whoever had been in that house wasn't just hiding. They had come prepared. And that meant premeditation. Mitchell straightened, exhaling through his nose. "That changes everything." Henry felt a chill creep down his spine. It wasn't a random killing. Mitchell shook his head. No, his voice was grim. This was an execution. The second warning. That night, Henry barely slept. Every sound made his muscles tense. Every shadow made his gut twist. He wasn't just worried about Olivia anymore. He was worried about Lily. Because if the real killer knew she had seen something, she wasn't safe. None of them were. Sometime around midnight, he finally drifted off, only to be ripped from sleep by a loud metallic bang outside. His pulse spiked. He was on his feet in seconds, his heart slamming against his ribs as he rushed to the front window. His mailbox. It was hanging open, the metal door bent slightly. And inside, a single white envelope. No stamp, no address. Henry's hands shook as he pulled it out. There was only one thing inside. A note. "Stay out of this. The truth beneath the lies. Henry didn't go back to sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the note in front of him, his mind racing. This wasn't random. Someone knew he was asking questions, and they didn't like it. When morning finally came, he was already dressed when his phone rang. "Mitchell, we have a new problem," the detective said without preamble. Olivia got a message. Henry's stomach twisted. What kind of message? Mitchell's voice was tight. A warning. Henry's grip tightened around the phone. Someone was watching. Someone was making sure Olivia stayed quiet. And now, they were making sure Henry did too. He took a slow, steady breath. You think she still has something they're looking for? Mitchell's pause was all the answer he needed. "Yeah," the detective said finally. "And we need to figure out what it is before they do." Henry's gaze flickered toward the guest room, where Lily was still curled up in bed. He had been dragged into something much bigger than he ever could have imagined. And he had a feeling. This was just the beginning. Buried truths and hidden enemies. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, but to Henry Lawson, the Monroe case had turned everything in his life into one long, sleepless night. Lily Monroe was still asleep in the guest room, curled up like a wounded animal, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She had barely spoken since she told them about the shadow in the hallway. Henry couldn't blame her. That kind of fear didn't just go away. And now someone had made sure he knew they were watching too. His fingers tightened around the cryptic note left in his mailbox. "Stay out of this." They were getting desperate. And that meant he was getting close to something. The shadow in the system. Henry wasn't a cop. But he knew someone who was. Detective Aaron Mitchell met him at a diner off the main road. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and where no one paid attention to whispered conversations in the back booth. Mitchell slid into the seat across from Henry, setting down his black coffee. "You look like hell," Mitchell muttered. Henry smirked humorlessly. "You should see how I feel." Mitchell's eyes flicked to the note Henry placed between them on the table. "You get this last night?" Henry nodded. Mitchell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "They're getting nervous." He lifted his gaze. "That means we're close." Henry leaned forward, voice low. "Then what the hell are we looking for?" Mitchell hesitated, then pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before turning it toward Henry. It was a bank statement. Daniel Monroe's bank account. At first, it looked like standard transactions, grocery store runs, mortgage payments, a gym membership. But then Henry's eyes caught something. Wire transfers. A lot of them. Mitchell watched him closely. "Notice anything?" Henry's stomach twisted. The money had been moving out of Daniel Monroe's account for months. But not to his mortgage company. Not to his credit cards. It was being drained into a shell company. And the name of the account owner? Elliot Crane. Henry looked up. "Is this?" Mitchell nodded grimly. "Organized crime." A cold wave of realization hit Henry. Daniel Monroe had been paying off someone. And then he stopped. Henry swallowed. "And when the money dried up?" Mitchell nodded. "He became more valuable dead than alive. A visitor in the night." That night, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He locked every door, checked every window. Still, the paranoia clung to him like a second skin. Lily was asleep again, finally, but Henry kept the living room light on. Just in case. Then, just past 2 a.m., a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. The creak of wood. A footstep. Henry's pulse spiked. Someone was outside. He moved to the window slowly, carefully, keeping the lights low. There, just beyond the street lamp, a figure. Tall, unmoving, watching. A black hoodie, hands in his pockets. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Henry's breath came shallow. This wasn't over. Not even close. Vanessa's secret. The next morning, Henry made a decision. He couldn't just react. He had to start fighting back. And that meant finding the one person who might know more than she was letting on. Vanessa Carter, Olivia's sister. Henry had never spoken to her, but he knew she had been too calm through all of this. Like she was waiting for something. Or someone. Detective Ramirez got them access to her financials. And sure enough, a deposit. $50,000. 2 days after Daniel Monroe's murder. Henry's stomach churned. Mitchell let out a slow exhale. Looks like she got paid. Henry's jaw clenched. For what? Mitchell's eyes darkened. For setting him up. The trap is set. Vanessa didn't know she was being watched. Henry made sure of it. She drove to a high-rise office downtown, parking in an underground lot. Mitchell and Ramirez had a wire on her phone. And then, they heard it. A call. A voice on the other end. Deep, calm, cold. Elliot Crane. Vanessa's voice wavered. It's done. Crane's voice was smooth, calculated. And the girl. Henry's blood ran cold. Lily. He clenched his fists. Vanessa hesitated. She's with the mailman. Silence. Then Crane spoke again, and this time his voice held an unmistakable threat. Then get rid of him. The final warning. Henry didn't have time to think. Didn't have time to plan. He just knew one thing. Lily was in danger, and he was the only thing standing between her and the people who wanted to erase every loose end. He floored the gas pedal, his truck skidding as he took a sharp turn toward his house. His phone buzzed. Mitchell. Henry. The detective's voice was sharp. You need to move. Now. I'm already moving. There's something else, Mitchell continued. The security footage from the Monroe house. Henry's grip tightened on the wheel. Yeah. Mitchell's voice dropped. It wasn't erased. Henry's breath hitched. What? Mitchell hesitated. It was swapped. Henry's pulse pounded. With what? A pause. Then Mitchell said 2 words that sent a chill straight down Henry's spine. Vanessa's footage. Henry slammed the brakes. The pieces clicked together too fast. Vanessa wasn't just helping Crane. She had been in the house, the night of the murder, and she had swapped the footage to protect herself. Henry's hands clenched around the wheel. Lily had seen a shadow in the hallway. Not just a killer, but her own aunt. The chase begins. By the time Henry reached his house, he knew he was too late. The front door was slightly open. No sign of a struggle. No sign of Lily. A lump formed in his throat. And then, a single message on his phone. A picture. Lily. In the backseat of a black SUV. A single line of text beneath it. Walk away, mailman. Henry's hands trembled as he gripped the phone. Then, slowly, his fear turned into something else. Rage. Because they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They took the wrong child. And Henry wasn't going to walk away. He was going to bring hell to their doorstep. The clock is ticking. Henry Lawson sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. They had taken Lily. And they thought he would just walk away. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Henry wasn't a cop. He wasn't a detective. But he was a man who had spent his entire life learning how to watch people, how to read them. And right now, he was reading one thing loud and clear. These bastards had made a mistake. His phone buzzed again. Another message. You have 1 hour. Then she disappears forever. Henry's pulse hammered. 1 hour. 60 minutes. 59 now. They wanted him to panic. They wanted him to make a mistake. But Henry wasn't going to run. He was going to hunt. The call that changed everything. Henry yanked his phone off the dashboard and dialed Detective Aaron Mitchell. The detective answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something." Henry's voice was sharp, laced with barely restrained fury. Mitchell's tone was just as tense. "We traced the SUV. It's registered to one of Elliot Crane's shell companies." Henry's grip tightened. "Where?" Mitchell hesitated. "It was last seen heading toward an industrial district on the outskirts of town." Henry's jaw clenched. "You think they're taking her there?" "It's possible." Mitchell exhaled. "Henry, listen to me. These people aren't small-time criminals. They're professionals. You can't just walk in there alone." Henry glanced at the dashboard clock. 53 minutes. He didn't have time to argue. "I'm not waiting." He hung up before Mitchell could protest. The warehouse. The address Mitchell had sent him led to a long-abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Rusted steel beams loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows in the dim light of the setting sun. The building looked deserted, but Henry knew better. He parked a block away, killed the engine, and moved on foot. A single black SUV sat outside the warehouse. Bingo. Henry crept closer, keeping to the shadows, his heart hammering. He peeked inside the SUV's backseat. Empty. Lily wasn't here, but someone was. A man in a dark jacket leaned against the hood, smoking a cigarette, his posture relaxed but alert. A guard, which meant Lily was inside. Henry's breath came slow and steady as he took in the surroundings. He needed to be smart about this. Then he spotted it, a wrench lying beside a rusted toolbox near the entrance. He grabbed it. The guard barely had time to react before Henry swung. A sickening crack. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the pavement. Henry didn't waste time. He snatched the guy's gun and slipped inside the warehouse. The trade. The inside of the warehouse was worse than Henry expected. Dim overhead lights flickered. Dust hung thick in the air. And then, his stomach dropped. Lily. She sat on a chair in the middle of the room, her hands tied behind her back, her wide eyes filled with fear. Standing next to her, Vanessa. Henry's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't bound. She wasn't a prisoner. She was part of this. A few feet away, another man stood, a tall figure with dark, calculating eyes. Elliot Crane, the man behind it all. Crane turned at the sound of Henry's footsteps, a slow smirk curling his lips. "Right on time," he said smoothly. Henry's grip tightened around the stolen gun. "If you hurt her, I swear to God." Crane laughed. "Oh, calm down, Mailman. The kid's fine. For now." He glanced at Vanessa. "Tell him." Vanessa's expression was unreadable. "Henry," she said, her voice almost regretful. "You shouldn't have come." Henry's blood boiled. "I shouldn't have come." His voice was low, dangerous. "You set up your own sister. You got your brother-in-law killed. And now you've kidnapped your own niece." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "No," Henry snapped. "I understand perfectly." Crane chuckled. "This is touching, really. But I have a deal to make." Henry's heart pounded. "What deal?" Crane gestured lazily. "You walk away. You forget everything. And the kid goes free." Henry's blood ran cold. "You expect me to believe that?" Crane smirked. "You don't have much of a choice." Henry's mind raced. He could see one gun tucked at Crane's waist, another one on the table. Vanessa wasn't armed, which meant Henry had one shot. He exhaled slowly. Then, he moved. Fast. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward, grabbed the gun from the table, and turned it on Crane. Vanessa gasped. Lily let out a small whimper. Crane froze. Henry's voice was lethal. The deals changed. The firefight. Crane's reaction was instant. He reached for his gun. Henry fired first. A sharp bang echoed through the warehouse. Crane staggered, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. Henry didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, slamming Crane against the table, knocking the gun from his grip. Vanessa screamed. A second later, the warehouse erupted. More men, at least 3. Gunfire rang out, bullets whizzing past Henry as he dove for cover. Lily let out a small sob. Henry gritted his teeth. He had to get to her. One shot. He fired. A man collapsed. Another shot. A second dropped. Crane was bleeding. Vanessa was frozen. Henry moved. He untied Lily's hands, scooping her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing. Henry ran. A bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't stop. Didn't slow. Didn't think. He just ran. And as he burst through the warehouse doors, into the night air, he heard the sound of sirens. Mitchell. And then, a single gunshot, a scream, and then, silence. The end of the nightmare. By the time Henry stopped running, the cops had taken control. Crane was in cuffs. His men were down. Vanessa was crying. And Henry, he was holding Lily like he'd never let her go. Mitchell ran toward them. "You good?" Henry exhaled. "She's safe." Mitchell nodded. Then he glanced at Vanessa. "She's not." Henry looked at her. At the sister who had destroyed everything. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she looked afraid. Henry didn't say a word, because she wasn't his problem anymore. He looked down at Lily. She was still shaking. He tightened his grip around her, then whispered, "You're safe now." And for the first time, she believed it. Aftermath of betrayal. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in chaotic streaks, reflecting off the steel walls of the abandoned warehouse. The tension in the air had shifted, from a deadly standoff to something quieter, heavier. The kind of silence that came when the dust settled, but the damage remained. Henry Lawson stood in the middle of it all, clutching Lily Monroe to his chest. She wasn't shaking anymore, just gripping onto him like he was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. He understood, because right now he felt the same. The world had tilted sideways over the past few days, revealing an ugly truth beneath the picture-perfect life of Cedarwood Estates. And now, the pieces were falling into place. Elliot Crane, arrested. His men, dead or in cuffs. The conspiracy, exposed. But there was one last loose end. Vanessa, the sister who had betrayed her own blood. And as Henry turned his gaze toward the squad car, where she sat with her hands cuffed behind her back, her eyes hollow with regret, he felt nothing. No sympathy, no anger, no satisfaction. Just emptiness. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. A broken family. The ride back to the police station was eerily quiet. Mitchell drove. Henry sat in the back seat with Lily, who was curled up against him, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt. She hadn't spoken since they left the warehouse. Henry didn't push. She'd been through too much. By the time they reached the station, the building was buzzing with activity. Officers moved in and out, paperwork shuffled, and the quiet murmur of conversations filled the air. But none of it mattered. Not to Lily. Not to Henry. And certainly not to Olivia Monroe. She was sitting in an interrogation room, still wearing the clothes from the night she was arrested. Except now, the handcuffs were gone. She was free. But she didn't look it. She looked like a woman who had lost everything. When she saw Lily in Henry's arms, something inside her broke. She let out a small, choked sound, half relief, half devastation, and stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Lily. The little girl didn't hesitate. She lunged toward her mother, wrapping her arms around Olivia's waist, burying her face in her stomach. Olivia collapsed to her knees, sobbing into Lily's hair, holding her so tightly it was like she was afraid she'd disappear if she let go. Henry stepped back, giving them space. But his chest ached. For Olivia. For Lily. For everything they had lost. The truth comes out. Detective Mitchell and Ramirez stood nearby, watching the reunion with unreadable expressions. Then Mitchell turned to Henry. "You did good, Lawson." Henry let out a humorless laugh. "Did I?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. If you hadn't stepped in, Lily would be gone, and Olivia would be in prison for a murder she didn't commit. Henry exhaled. He knew that, but it didn't make any of this feel better. Mitchell cleared his throat. "We processed Vanessa's confession." Henry's gaze snapped to his. "She talked." Mitchell nodded grimly. Once she realized Crane wasn't getting out of this, she turned on him. Said she never meant for Daniel to die. He hesitated, but she knew he would. Henry clenched his fists. She sold him out. Mitchell's expression hardened. She thought she was protecting Olivia. Thought if she gave Daniel up, it would keep the heat off her sister. Henry let out a slow breath. So she set her up instead. Mitchell nodded. It was supposed to be a scare tactic, but Crane doesn't leave loose ends. Henry shook his head, disgust twisting in his gut. And now? Mitchell's expression darkened. She's facing conspiracy charges, maybe more. She won't see daylight for a long time. Henry didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Vanessa had chosen this. Now she had to live with it. A fresh start, or something close to it. Hours passed before Olivia was officially released. Henry waited outside the station with Lily, watching as the mother and daughter clung to each other like lifelines. Eventually, Olivia turned to him. She looked exhausted, hollow, but grateful. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Henry shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do." Her eyes softened. "No, you didn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling around them. Then Olivia exhaled. "I don't know what happens next." Henry glanced at Lily, who was curled up in the passenger seat of Olivia's car, finally asleep. He sighed. "I don't either. But maybe that was okay. Because for the first time in days, Lily was safe. And that was enough. For now. One last loose end. 2 days later, Henry was back on his mail route. Everything had returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. But there was still one thing that didn't sit right with him. Vanessa had given up Crane, but Crane had a boss, someone higher up. And whoever they weren't finished. Henry felt it. The way the back of his neck prickled. The way his gut twisted when he saw an unfamiliar black car parked down the street. Someone was watching, waiting. And Henry. He wasn't done either. Because if they thought he would walk away, they were dead wrong. The final warning. The world had gone back to normal. Or at least it pretended to. 2 weeks had passed since Elliot Crane was arrested. Since Vanessa Carter's betrayal had been laid bare. Since Olivia Monroe had been freed. And Lily had been returned to her mother's arms. 2 weeks since Henry Lawson had almost died. And yet, there was still a shadow hanging over him, because Crane wasn't the top of the food chain. And whoever was really in charge, they weren't done yet. The man in the car. The first time Henry saw him, he thought it was a coincidence. A black sedan, parked down the street from his house. Engine running. Windows tinted too dark to see inside. The second time, he knew better. It was there when he was on his mail route, idling near the Monroe house. Watching. Waiting. The third time, Henry was ready. He parked his mail truck on the side of the street, grabbed his phone, and walked straight toward the car. It didn't move. Didn't even try to hide. Henry's pulse thrummed in his ears as he reached the driver's side. He tapped on the window. Silence. Then, the window rolled down. And for the first time, Henry saw the man inside. Older, maybe in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, sharp features, cold, calculating eyes, and a smirk that sent ice crawling down Henry's spine. "You've been busy," the man said, his voice smooth, almost amused. Henry didn't flinch. "I don't know who the hell you are, but if you're here to send a message." The man chuckled. "Oh, Mr. Lawson, the message has already been sent." Henry's grip tightened on his phone. "That's so." The man nodded, his smirk deepening. Elliot Crane was useful. Until he wasn't. Henry's stomach turned. And Vanessa. A slow, amused shrug. Disposables tend to dispose of themselves. Henry froze. What the hell did that mean? The man leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mailman, do you think you won?" Henry's breath was slow, steady. "I think your people are in prison. And I think Lily Monroe is safe." The man's smirk didn't falter. For now. Henry's blood ran cold. The man chuckled, sensing the shift. "Oh, relax. No one is coming for the girl." He tilted his head. "But you made quite a mess." Henry's jaw clenched. "I'll live with it." "Will you?" The man exhaled, as if he were bored now. "I could have you removed, you know." Henry didn't blink. "Then why haven't you?" A pause. Then the man grinned. "I like to see how things play out." He rolled the window up. The black sedan pulled away. Henry stood there, watching. And he knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Vanessa's fate. 3 days later, Vanessa Carter was dead. Henry heard about it on the news. Inmate found dead in holding cell. No sign of foul play. But Henry knew better. He saw the way Mitchell clenched his jaw when he read the case report. Saw the way Olivia didn't even react when she heard the news. They all knew. Vanessa hadn't killed herself. She had been silenced. She had played the game. And lost. But Henry. He was still standing. And he had a choice. Walk away. Or fight back. The letter. Henry sat in his kitchen that night, staring at the blank envelope that had been left in his mailbox. No name. No stamp. Inside, a single slip of paper. "Stay in your lane, Mailman." Henry exhaled slowly. Then he grabbed a match, watched the paper curl and blacken as the flames ate it whole. And when it was nothing but ash, he made his choice. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. The final stand. The weight of everything settled on Henry Lawson's shoulders as he stared at the last message. Stay in your lane, Mailman. A warning. A threat. But most of all, a mistake. Because Henry wasn't the kind of man who took threats lightly. He had spent his life observing people, reading between the lines, knowing when something didn't add up. And right now, nothing added up. Vanessa was dead. Elliot Crane was behind bars. But the man in the black sedan, the one who had been watching, the one who had spoken like he was the one really in charge, he was still out there. And Henry wasn't about to let him win. Not after what they had done. Not after what they had taken. The final piece of the puzzle. Henry's first stop was Detective Mitchell. He found him at his office, hunched over a pile of case files, his face lined with exhaustion. Mitchell didn't look up as Henry walked in. "You look like hell." Henry smirked. "You should see how I feel." Mitchell finally lifted his gaze. His expression was grim. "I take it you got a message too." Henry's smirk faded. "Yeah." Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. Vanessa's death wasn't a suicide. Henry's stomach tightened. "I figured." Mitchell hesitated. Then he pulled a file from his desk and slid it toward Henry. Henry opened it, and his blood ran cold. It wasn't just Elliot Crane. It was bigger. A network. Bribery. Money laundering. Shell companies stretching across multiple states. And the man in the black sedan. Damian Hale. CEO of Hale Industries. A name that meant power, influence, and control. And now, a name that Henry would never forget. Henry exhaled slowly. So Crane was never the one running the show. Mitchell shook his head. "No, Hale is." He gestured to the file. "And if you go after him, you'll end up like Vanessa." Henry's jaw clenched. Or worse, a dangerous plan. Henry could have walked away. Should have walked away. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face. The fear in her eyes. The way she had clung to him, trusting him to keep her safe. And he knew. He couldn't let this go. So he did what he did best. He watched. He learned Hale's routine. He found out where he worked, where he ate, where he parked his car. And then, he set the trap. The meeting that changed everything. Damian Hale walked into his office at exactly 8:00 a.m. At 8:02, his phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Hale frowned, answering with a clipped, "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "I know what you did." Silence. Then Hale chuckled. "You'll have to be more specific." Henry's voice was calm, controlled. "You killed Vanessa Carter. You framed Olivia Monroe. You set everything in motion." Hale leaned back in his chair. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Henry smirked. "Oh, I'm not the one you should be worried about." Hale's smirk faltered. "Check your inbox." Hale's computer pinged. A new email. He opened it, and his face drained of color. Surveillance footage. Wire transfers. A full list of names. Asterisk asterisk judges. Politicians. High-ranking officials. Asterisk asterisk, all tied to Hale's operation. It was everything. And it had just been sent to the FBI. Hale's voice turned sharp. "You have no idea what you've just done." Henry's smile didn't falter. "Oh, I do." A long pause. Then Hale exhaled. "This isn't over." Henry's jaw tightened. "Yeah, it is." He hung up and waited. The fall of a king. By noon, the news broke. Breaking. Business tycoon Damian Hale arrested for corruption and organized crime. Henry stood on his porch, sipping his coffee as he watched the reports roll in. They got everything. His accounts, his contacts, his entire empire. Gone. And just like that, it was over. The end, and a new beginning. A week later, Henry was back on his usual mail route. The Monroe house was quiet again, but this time, in a good way. Lily was outside, playing in the yard. Olivia sat on the porch, watching her with an easy kind of peace Henry hadn't seen before. She spotted him and smiled. Henry smiled back. For the first time in weeks, everything felt okay. Maybe not perfect. Maybe not how it used to be. But better. And that was enough. For now. Final line. Henry walked down the street, mailbag slung over his shoulder. And as he did, he passed a car parked on the corner. Not a black sedan. Not tinted windows. Just a regular car. But the man inside, he was watching. Henry didn't stop. Didn't react. Because he knew. There would always be more. More corruption. More people who thought they were untouchable. More monsters in the dark. And if they came knocking, Henry Lawson would be ready. Always.